with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show. Okay, everybody, welcome to the Phronesis podcast. Thank you so much for checking in wherever you are in the world. We are joined today by Dr. Toby Newstead. She is a respected leadership scholar and practitioner at the University of Tasmania, located in the Lutruwita on the lands of the Palawa and the Pakana people. With a background in corporate change, leadership development, and professional communications, she brings practical expertise to her academic, coaching, and consulting work. An internationally recognized researcher, Dr. Newstead specializes in virtue-based leadership development, leadership ethics, and leadership in the volunteer sector. Her research appears in the world's best underlined journals. Dr. Newstead is an established executive leadership coach and deeply engaged with industry and community. She regularly delivers impactful workshops, keynotes, and facilitation sessions. Dr. Newstead's research, teaching, coaching, and facilitation has local and international impact, shaping the leaders of today and tomorrow. Toby, thank you so much for joining me. I have seen your name, I have read your work, and now you are in front of me, and I'm so excited for this conversation. So what's not in your bio? What do people need to know about you?
Well, I don't know if they need to know it, but I guess one little addition is that I am in Tasmania now and have been for some time, but I actually originate from, well, loosely your neck of the woods. I come from a tiny little island in the Pacific Northwest called Lasqueti Island, and some of my fellow Lasquetians might not like me naming it because it's a pretty intentionally isolated little island. It's off-grid and a tiny little population of about 300 to 400 people. And so I grew up very much in the bush. We had to make our own electricity and grow a lot of our own food. And there was no car ferry and no hospital, no police, no doctors, none of that. It's a very sort of funny, quirky, perhaps unexpected upbringing before I then found my way to Tasmania and into academia.
Okay, so now I'm intrigued. Are you American or are you Canadian?
Canadian. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's on the very southwest corner of Canada.
Southwest corner. Okay, so in British Columbia, BC.
Yes.
That is so awesome. So you had to, there was a phrasing there, make our own electricity. Is that accurate?
Mm-hmm. Well, generate. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. How did you generate was it a generator? Solar?
Oh, only on the shoulder season. So in the summer we had solar panels way before solar panels were cool. And in the winter, there's a lot of very, very inventive, industrious people on Lasqueti, and one of them invented a little gravity-fed water turbine that actually the turbine is constructed out of teaspoons. So we had a tiny little water wheel that generated our power in the winter.
How did school work?
Oh, well, we had an amazing program of field trips. I think when I was in grade 3 or 4, we spent a week kayaking and camping on the West Coast on a series of little islands for a week. Another class rode their bikes through the Rocky Mountains. So we had a hugely wild and wonderful field trip program, which was spearheaded by the principal we had at the time, who actually, here's a segue, and it's accidental, but that principal of my school on Lasqueti, and I left. I moved off. My parents moved me off to put me through high school because they recognize the field trips were amazing, but I was basically illiterate by the end of grade 5. The principal we had on Laskeety actually was trained in the Virtues Project. And it was the Virtues Project that I then serendipitously came into contact with again in high school, and then again tracked down when I was doing my consulting work pre-PhD. And that sort of led me into the academic space because it was the Virtues Project and virtues-based approaches to developing character and community that made me interested in leadership and leadership development.
Oh, I love it. So cool. That's so fascinating. Well, let's go there. Let's talk about virtues-based leadership development. What do listeners need to know about this space? We've never had a conversation about this specific topic on the podcast. So what are a few things? Where do you want to take us?
I think, so in addition to this sort of lingering and rather organic personal association that I had with virtues and this sort of grassroots program that is out there called the Virtues Project. When I ended up then, and I had a background in professional communications, and that's what sort of got me into the corporate consulting space and doing sort of leadership development and workplace culture change projects. And I kind of had this like inkling that we needed to go back to virtues. And I had no academic understanding of it, no theoretical or philosophical understanding of it, but I had experienced it, like what it did for me as a young kid, as a teenager, being in a place, in a community, a school community where virtues were the means through which we recognized what was best about each other and recognized how to fix things when we were doing things that weren't in alignment with what is best about ourselves and each other. And so I was trying to feed this into the work we were doing in the corporate consulting space. And as you might imagine, when you're talking to corporate clients about things like virtues, there's a little bit of reluctance, and it's a bit of a what? Like they think you're going to drag them off to Sunday school or something. And so it was that sort of made me, I was like, well, surely it's not that. So that's what sort of prompted me to take it into the academic realm and start doing a bit more research around it and how virtues do fit into the leader and leadership development puzzle. Something that I've come back to the more comfortable I get in the research space. And this is one of the reasons I absolutely adore your podcast, because you do such an elegant job of bridging the research practice gap. It isn't entirely a gap, and it shouldn't be a gap. But I think when we're looking to bridge research and practice, there might be a temptation to like dumb down research, which I don't think we need to do. Like practitioners are super switched on, bright people, and they might be time poor. And virtues, to me, is something that tends to be dumbed down when we're talking to practitioners. And a lot of people want to call them something else. Practitioners don't like the word virtues, so we'll call them something else. Yeah. And that, I think, underestimates the wisdom of practitioners and then undersells, which is a crude word to use when we're talking about virtues, but undersells the value of what virtues are and what they can bring to leaders and leadership development.
Well, you said that it's foundational, or you said that it's kind of a piece of the puzzle and important. I mean, it seems to me like it's almost like the border pieces of the puzzle. Would you agree or disagree, or how do you think about that? It seems foundational. That's another way for me to think about this. It seems like a pretty darn important starting point and then through line in the work. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And foundational in every sense. Foundational because it is a part of leader and leadership development that we can start working on when we're very young. We're both parents, and when we're thinking about, ourselves when we were children, and then trying to raise children and bring them up to be decent, contributing, happy, whole humans, developing virtues and character is probably the most fundamental or foundational thing that we need to do. And then that's developing their capacity to lead in the future. And for us as individuals, our virtues and character is, in my view, absolutely foundational to our potential to lead, at least to lead in ways that are both effective and ethical.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the children. I mean, it's such an interesting thing when you look at just even social learning theory, Bandura, and for probably a child becomes somewhat present with the world. Let's just go 2.5. I don't know the exact age, but between there and probably, maybe around your children's age, around 12, 11, you're the center of gravity as far as what's shaping their lived environment. And if those have been baked into, like in some ways it was baked into your education early on and are a part of the conversation and a part of the existence, I mean, think of that foundation that we're setting for people. But oftentimes it's not.
I say it, and it is a simple premise, but it's so incredibly difficult. I don't mean to suggest that I do anywhere near a good job of it, but even just in sort of to circle back to this idea that we shouldn't be reticent to speak of virtues. My children are very familiar with the term virtues and with different virtues and can call me out and call each other out, which I think is a big part of it. It's not about being perfect. It's about having something to come back to.
Well, that's awesome. I mean, the fact that you have given them permission to call you out, I mean, again, family, parenting is one of the ultimate leadership opportunities, and it's a mirror. And so I had my daughter call me out about a week and a half ago. She said, you interrupted me. And I said, okay, I apologize. Continue. But I think that's empowering for them. We have to be modeling what it is we espouse. And so it's an opportunity for us to learn and develop and grow as well. I mean, ultimately, if you look at it through that lens, we can be learning and developing and modeling that or failing at that and then acknowledging we've failed. That's all great lessons for our children.
Yeah. And that really is the crux of virtues-based leader and leadership development is the idea of role modeling. So when I'm working with students or working with industry partners, it really does. One of the ways to come at understanding how virtues inform leadership is just to think about a leader that has had some sort of positive or profound impact on us, maybe someone very close to us, like a parent or a family member, maybe someone from the workplace, or maybe someone even quite distant to us that we met once, or that is a media figure or a sports coach or whatever. Usually when we think about just simple single words that describe that person, usually we're going to use characterological words. Which speaks to the power of character, which is grounded in these sort of virtuous habits or how virtues comprise character. So that's one way that I find is quite a nice entry point to considering virtues and character and how they lead to leadership that might enable us to be a little more effective and ethical. So that sort of speaks to the role modeling part. And then the other part that I think is very foundational to a virtues-based approach is the power of language. And much like you say, like any interaction, not just that you got to give a good speech at the annual company-wide Christmas gala or whatever it is, but it's those daily frequent interactions. And again, this is not something that's easy, but it is something that is simple. And with practice, it can become more of a habit. And when we try to infuse our language with virtues words and use virtues as recognition of what we want to see more of, and when we use virtues as invitations for what we would like to see more of when perhaps we're not seeing it. And when we use virtues to set up sort of expectations of how we want to be and work and live together, those are things we do anyways. And if we just infuse it with the virtues language, then all of a sudden we're speaking to a person's character and we're sort of drawing their attention to their capacity to develop virtues and therefore sort of supporting our own and their leadership development and character development.
Well, and I don't know the year that some of these concepts go back to. You probably know that better than I do, but it's ancient wisdom in many ways. And so you have a Ryan Holiday who has made Stoicism very sexy. But it's so interesting because I've been exploring this space, Toby, and it's a really interesting space. And coming out of industry, you'll appreciate this in a really nice way. You called it the research practitioner gap. And again, I don't know that that's the right phrasing, like you said, but there is this middle space. There's this middle space because your average practitioner is not reading Leadership Quarterly, nor do they know it exists. They're reading maybe Harvard Business Review, probably Fortune, maybe Inc., and that's kind of what's being consumed. And maybe they're not reading Heifetz and Linsky or Margaret Wheatley. They're reading, Jocko Willink and Ryan Holiday and a number of other kind of influencer type individuals, John Maxwell, who again, in many ways, I always say on the podcast, there's value in that work. And there's this middle space that I think is missing, this a little more complexity, not so inaccessible that we lose folks. But I think a challenge at times is existing in that middle space. I struggle with it sometimes, even in this podcast, where I have, for instance, Toby, I have a newsletter. And what's been so interesting about that project is that because the goal of the newsletter was the same thing. Can I get good content into the hands of practitioners? I want them to read Ron Riggio's little piece in Psychology Today. I want them to understand that Barbara Kellerman has a blog. I want them to know that there's other pieces out there that are leaders that can, I think, kind of exist in that middle ground pretty nicely. They understand the literature like a wizard, but they communicate it in a way that it's accessible. I can't find scholars. I can't find them. Who blogs that are some of our world's best scholars? Who's blogging on a consistent basis? And it's few and far. Adam Grant maybe is, and maybe Brene Brown, and maybe Amy Edmondson and Ron Riggio, and there's some others that I've kind of come across. But it's fascinating. So what fills that space is Korn Ferry, Center for Creative Leadership, McKinsey, a lot of that type of content. And then again, that stuff from Inc., Bloomberg, Business Week, and stuff like that. So there's this really, really interesting opportunity, I think. You know, the ILA has some blogs where some scholars, Richard Bolden will write an article for the ILA, and there'll be a blog post there, and I'll include those as well. But there's just this gap, this really interesting gap that, I don't know. I'd love to hear your perspective on that, because again, coming out of industry, you have to have a really interesting perspective on that question.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, there's so many different ways we could look at exploring why that gap exists. And one very, I think, fundamental and perhaps crude reason is that when we are research active, we are not incentivized to translate our research into anything palatable or even meaningful to people actually doing the work that we're researching. That's sort of a structural answer.
Yeah. Yep.
And there are some outlets, like there's HBR, there's also Org Dynamics, there's a couple, California Management Review. Like there are a few publications that a university will recognize, so that still helps, the instrumental academic progress their career. But as you say, a lot of them are still behind paywalls, so I don't actually know who's reading them.
Yeah, and so the articles I can find are, again, it's Deloitte, it's McKinsey, it's Gallup, it's all of that kind of becomes the center of gravity for practitioners. Because I can go to the blog, I can access that content. It displaces us as a center of gravity for that practitioner. So, and I couldn't agree with you more that it's very structural in how we are set up as institutions. And all that incredible work, because I know that there's incredible work, it's missed. It's not there.
Another opportunity that, and this would vary, discipline by discipline, institution by institution, is the opportunity to have sort of ongoing relationships with industry bodies or peaks or, some form of industry that then has tentacles or some influence on what else is happening. You said in my bio that I do a lot of work on leadership in the volunteering sector, which is a fascinating arena within which to look at leadership because, and you know this, most of our leadership research assumes that when we're talking leader-follower, we're talking manager, subordinate employee, and we're looking at for paid contexts, which actually around the world, more people are engaged in volunteering than paid work. So that's actually a bigger arena within which we can look at leadership. But anyways, within my work in the leadership and volunteering contexts, I work with our peak bodies. So we have peak bodies within each state and then across the country, which then means that I'm allowed to hear what's happening within their industry without having to talk to every single volunteer involving organization. And they in turn get to sort of access some of our work in a way that they can help us translate so that it's meaningful for them and all of their members. So, I mean, that takes time. And again, that's not always incentivized and that's not always sort of within the remit of people who are really exceptional at research. So it is a funny space. And I think it's not one wish, but I do wish that practitioners had just a little bit more sense of what it means to be a piece of research and the difference between a report commissioned by McKinsey and something that has gone through a rigorous peer review process.
Yeah.
And just what that means. They might be able to, they've probably heard those words before, but what that means in terms of validity and rigor and the fact that when we're publishing peer-reviewed research, we're not trying to sell anything.
Yes, nicely said. That's very, very well said. What else are you thinking about right now? What's kind of top of mind for you? I mean, I love the kind of work in the space of virtue. I love the interface with practitioners and in the community and kind of looking at this from that perspective. Obviously, from a research standpoint, you've published in the world's best journals. What's keeping you intrigued right now as you do the work?
A couple of years ago, and it's actually when we were locked down during COVID and I couldn't collect any data from actual human beings. One of my favorite scholars in the virtues and leadership ethics space is Joanne Chula. Have you had Joanne?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
We
Love her work.
did an entire episode on the emotion of resentment.
Oh, awesome. Yes. I remember when she was, starting to look at that. Yep. And she once said to me, if you want to be taken seriously in the field, you have to solo author. So I thought, okay, well, I'm locked down. It's COVID. I can't work with anyone really. So I may as well try to do this solo authoring thing. And it was very lonely, and I've done it, and I'm not in a hurry to do it again. But what I did, again, because I couldn't collect data from humans, and because of this sort of research practice sort of interface thing, and I know I came into academia because I know that virtues were not palatable within the corporate space, at least at that time in the corporate space I was playing in. So I took virtues based on the philosophy of virtue ethics and based on fairly robust frameworks of virtues. And I used them to look at the top TED Talks on leadership. And there's lists. So I didn't decide which the top talks were. I just went to, and it was Inc. and it was TED and it was Forbes, I think, who said, these are the top, if you want to be a good leader, you got to listen to these TED Talks. Yep. So I analyzed them to see how they were explicitly and implicitly referencing virtues when they were describing what a good leader is or does and what good leadership may be. And it was fun. That's in Journal of Business Ethics. And it was a fun paper to write. And it was fun because I got to read the transcripts and watch these TED Talks. But what was interesting, and I think when we talk about virtues, and if we start to think about what virtues are, we very quickly see their role in enabling us to be the best of ourselves and to connect to one another. That human community and the sustainability of human community goes really back. Peterson and Seligman and their sort of tome of positive psychology is all about virtues and the role of virtues in sustaining human communities. What was interesting in that paper I wrote based on the TED Talks, which some might be loosely informed by research and some weren't, what I found interesting was the prevalence with which transcendence, which is a virtue, was referenced, usually implicitly. And so transcendence is about our connection to sort of the intangible. So humanity is more the virtue of how you and I connect as humans in our human communities. Transcendence is more, I don't prescribe to a religion myself, and I've already said that I think that is something that almost makes people reluctant to engage in virtues because they think it's going to be religious. And when I was working on that paper, that helped me understand that reluctance comes back to, the separation of church and state, and virtues and ethics were sort of left to the church and therefore out of scope for business and politics.
Interesting.
But I think this idea of transcendence, and again, not necessarily religion, but something greater than ourselves and something, being in nature or mindfulness or connection to country or something bigger than us just as humans. And when you listen to TED Talks with that in mind, you'll hear it. Everyone's talking about meaning and purpose and higher purpose. And that's this virtue of transcendence. And I just find that really, really fascinating. That's something that I'm mulling over because I think, yes, we need to be connected to one another, absolutely, as humans and in community, but also this, without being secular, something we need to recognize that there is another element to what it means to be and achieve our potential together.
Well, it almost seems like with your eye and with the knowledge of what you have and then your eye, you can probably see these concepts literally everywhere because they're basic human. And again, it's ancient wisdom that didn't just come from someone's mind, and it stood the test of time. And you probably see these all over the place. They're just not being called what they are. Is that accurate?
Well, and we call them what they are often if we're talking about someone being wise or someone being courageous or that was fair or just. Like we do use virtues words, but I don't think we always understand that these, disparate words actually fit within a very sort of comprehensive umbrella. And when you talk about ancient, I think especially if we sit sort of in the Western Aristotelian virtue ethics approach, we think, oh, ancient, because, Aristotle and Plato and all them were a few thousand years ago. But actually, they're like new kids on the block when we think about Indigenous traditions.
Yes.
Yeah. And Ron and I edited a book on leadership and virtues a couple of years ago, and we had submissions from two amazing Aboriginal Australian women, and they're talking about their virtues traditions that go back 60,000 years.
Yeah. They're like, sit down for a sec.
Yeah.
We're going to
Back of the bus, Aristotle.
Oh, that's so awesome. That's so fascinating. What else is kind of keeping your mind cooking right now?
So when we're thinking again about how virtues, in more of a sort of a practical sense, how virtues can inform our leadership and our leadership development, and again, I'm sort of phrasing this in very lay terms, but I don't think that undersells the rigor of what it is. And again, simple doesn't mean easy, but it is quite simple. Another thing that we can do to sort of use virtues to develop ourselves and our leadership. And that's this idea that once we start to familiarize ourselves with virtues and with the virtues that comprise our character, then our challenge is to use the virtues of our character to inform what we do and how we decide and sort of the actions that we take in the world in a way that I think, again, is simple but not easy. To think about this is that, and we've all heard the stimuli response, how that works. And really what we can think about is in between the stimuli and response is inserting virtues of character or inserting what is best about us. So if we can sort of expand this space just a little bit, just enough between stimuli and response to be like, wait a minute, who do I actually want to be? What part of my character do I want to call on here so that I'm deciding and being and acting in accordance with the person I actually want to be in the world? Is this an opportunity for me to be wise, or for me to be humble, or for me to be kind, or for me to be generous, or for me to be courageous, or for me to be, and the more we can just insert that reflection between stimuli and response, then that's us starting to learn, develop, practice, and habituate virtues, which will help enhance us as leaders and our practice of leadership.
Learn, develop, and habituate. I loved that. That was incredible phrasing right there, because it can be done. It very much can be done. But I think a lot of our leader development programming, oftentimes, it goes from kind of one topic to another topic to another topic, and we never really go all that deep in any one thing. So we don't get to a place of habituation. We don't necessarily it might be a semester class where they have you for a professor and you challenge them to do that, but then that's gone 6 months later or 5 months later. Not to diminish your work. Please don't take it that way. If it's not being reinforced. Yeah. And so it's just such an interesting space, the whole leader development conversation, because I think sometimes there's all the opportunity in the world for us to do this well. And the closest we probably get are some of our military institutions, because they kind of have a person for 4 to 8 to 10 or 12 years, and they can take them through a process. In normal day-to-day life, one of the puzzles I love to think about is, how do we do that? How do we do that outside of some of these contexts where that's the case, so that we truly can habituate that? And a whole bunch of other things, so that the person is better prepared to serve in these really, really complex roles. I mean, I love that puzzle. Yeah. I absolutely love that puzzle.
Yeah. Well, and this is, I think we've mentioned both Ron Riggio and David Day, but when you're talking leader and leadership development, you kind of have to mention those two. And I think that they both have made very profound contributions. And it was actually a recent conversation with David that prompted me to restructure all of my assessments in my teaching, so that now, instead of, producing a report and an essay and a presentation and a debate, whatever it might be, or case analysis, now what I'm trying to do is build in an assessment around my students developing their own personal leadership development plan.
Yeah.
That idea of owning your own leadership development, I think, is when we only have them, like you say, for a semester or maybe a course. Some of my students I get for a couple of years, but I only, teach them once or twice. But the more I think we can impart that you are the one that owns your leadership development. Yeah, I think that's, for those of us in the space that we're in, I think that's
so it's so interesting.
That's something we can do.
Oh, it's so interesting. And we could geek out on this, and it would probably be a really long podcast episode. But I do wonder, I've had this conversation with a friend, David Rush, and are we approaching leader development wrong? Should we, in some of our courses, at least in the beginning, be more intentional about building the habits of mind, building the practices of mindfulness, or what are the critical reflection? What are the 5 or 6 base level tools that will serve me for the rest of my life and keep me in a place of, again, critical reflection, reflexivity, you know what I'm saying? Mindfulness,
Yeah.
presence,
Yeah.
those things, rather than teaching path goal theory.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah.
If you're going to own your development, let's give you some tools in the very beginning to
Yeah.
kind of start off
Yeah.
engaging in dialogue with people with differences and
Yeah.
training that and really building that
Yeah.
in. That's a
Yeah.
different way of getting at leader development.
Yeah, totally. And I actually think, and maybe it's out there and I've missed it, but one thing, the work on developmental readiness,
Hmm.
I think is something that could and should be baked in so much more into our efforts.
Oh,
Like you say, if there's a foundation to, university leader development or even just straight up leadership course, or if we're doing in-house programs, or if we're doing, community programs, I don't think personally, and this is a whole nother sort of can of worms, but I don't think we should be picking high potential. I think we should be looking for developmental readiness, and we should be working to develop the indicators of developmental readiness. Because once we're ready, anything will work to develop us. But if we're not ready, nothing will work. And I think we can be high potential within whatever sphere and not ready to develop.
Yeah.
As leaders, especially ethical leaders.
100%. Because the high potentials may have any number of different motivations for choosing to be engaged in that. Okay. As we begin to wind down our time, I always ask guests what you've been listening to, streaming, what's caught your attention in recent times. It could be something you've been listening to, and it could have nothing to do with what we've just discussed. What is caught your attention recently that listeners might be interested in?
Maybe all of your listeners have already read this book or listened to this book, and I think I'm late to the party. But my holiday reading was Lessons in Chemistry, which I absolutely adored. Have you read it?
I haven't. Was that made into a television show?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe. I don't know.
Okay. Oh.
But I absolutely adored it. That was my indulgence over the holidays, because I tend to read mainly peer-reviewed journal articles, which is pretty boring. So sorry to all my brilliant scholar friends, but it's a very different way of reading than sitting on the beach reading Lessons in Chemistry. So I loved that. That was fantastic. And I loved it for many reasons, because I'm a rower and the home chef, cook, and an academic and a bit of a feminist. So loved that book. Highly recommend it. Oh, yeah. The other is, now that I'm back, and this sort of goes back to our conversation around ancient wisdom. And I'm reading a book called The Dreaming Path by Paul Callahan and Raghu Marcus, who are 2 Aboriginal men from here in Australia. And I'm finding it really fascinating because, and maybe this will resonate with you, but working in knowledge creation, being researchers, and our whole mandate is to generate and disseminate knowledge. One of the things that I'm finding really fascinating as I try to learn more about Aboriginal Australian culture and traditions and wisdom and history is a very different approach to knowledge. So I've heard a few different times in conversations in my reading, including this book called The Dreaming Path, that knowledge is not a buffet. It's not a come and serve yourself and help yourself to whatever you want and get as much as you want. It is very much curated, and you get the knowledge that is deemed appropriate at the point in time that is deemed appropriate when you're ready. And it's a much sort of slower, more curated pace to the acquisition of knowledge and wisdom. And I just think in our very frenetic world, that's, for me, it's kind of like a deep breath, or like a bit of reprieve to be reminded of the wisdom in slowing down.
Well, in some ways, at least for me, what came to me when you just said that was it goes back to your childhood in some ways. You had this slower paced education designed to spark curiosity. Back to what I just said about leader development. Should we be sparking curiosity rather than jumping into 2 + 2 = 4? Should we be, getting people just on fire about learning and curiosity about the world and exploring the world and experiencing, and then they're in? And so at least that came to mind for me, slowing down and approaching the work in a little bit of a different way. because you strike me as a very curious person. That's something you very much value and want to pursue, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually, when I was starting out my PhD and having a moment of, oh my God, can I do this? What am I thinking? I had and it was a fleeting conversation. He probably doesn't even remember it, but a childhood friend. And he said, of course you can do it. You're the most curious person I know. And that was it. And I go back to that all the time. And I think, and in a virtues frame, we can see that curiosity is sort of a precursor to wisdom. So it's the only way to learn and glean any wisdom is to remain ever curious.
Yep. Love it. Maybe that's what we'll call the episode, Ever Curious. I like it. Toby, thank you so much. So good to be with you. Appreciate your time today. Thank you very, very much. We'll do it again. And you know what? I'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Scott. It's been great.
The connections for me here are clear. Are you a leader who is honest, brave, just, generous? And these all lead to an individual of strong character. And hopefully we have leaders of strong character. Now, something that I don't think is discussed enough is that we can practice these virtues. And that is a wonderful opportunity as a parent, as a manager, to literally view work as an opportunity to practice each and every day. View home as an opportunity to practice each and every day. And of course, all of us will never be honest, brave, just, and generous 100% of the time, but we're in the game. And I think that for me is the practical wisdom. Toby, you have helped me think about this topic in a new and important way. This content is foundational to a great human, and I also believe a great leader. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us, and thanks for your good work, Toby. And to all of you, thanks for checking in. You can practice. So go practice. Stop listening. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.